The American Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, was a defining moment in U.S. history and the bloodiest war the country ever experienced. It pit Americans against other Americans, often splitting families and friends apart along the lines of loyalty to the North or the South. Profound disagreements rendered many close relationships asunder as they chose sides in the great conflict. Let's take a look at 6 important people who experienced the pain of that division in their own lives. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union's top general, was married to Julia Dent Grant. Hailing from St. Louis, Missouri, her wealthy family had strong ties to the South and the Confederacy when secession was declared. Her father, Frederick Dent, was a slaveholder and a prominent figure in Missouri. He was initially against the secession of Missouri from the Union, but later aligned himself with the Confederacy. He served in the Missouri State Guard, a pro-Confederate militia, and his property was utilized as a base for Southern troops. Julia Dent Grant's brother, Frederick Dent Jr., fought for the rebellion as well, serving as a colonel in the Confederate Army during the war. James Longstreet was Ulysses S. Grant's brother-in-law through marriage to Julia's sister, Maria. Longstreet and Grant had become close friends while attending the United States Military Academy at West Point. In fact, before the war, Longstreet served as an usher at the wedding of Ulysses and Julia Dent Grant. The wedding took place on August 22, 1848, at the Dent family home, known as White Haven, near St. Louis, Missouri, in a slaveholding state. That friendship was tested with the start of hostilities, as Longstreet supported the South and Grant the North. Longstreet enlisted in the Confederate Army and rose to become a prominent Confederate general, as well as a close associate of Robert E. Lee. Longstreet played a significant role in various battles, including the First Battle of Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. Many died, were wounded, or permanently injured on both sides. Grant and Longstreet were during the war like so many. However, in later years, as some of the bitterness from the war faded, the two generals exchanged letters and eventually were able to reconcile to some extent. But they were never as close as they had been before the Civil War. Sam Houston, a prominent figure in the early history of Texas, had a complex and at times controversial relationship with the issues of secession and the American Civil War. His Union sympathies, which were well known, had significant impacts on his life and career. Sam Houston was elected as the first president of the Republic of Texas in 1836 and later served as the state senator, and then as its governor when Texas joined the United States as the 28th state in 1845. His strong Unionist views, however, put him at odds with the secessionist sentiments that were growing in the slave states as tensions escalated between North and South. In 1861, when Texas voted to secede from the Union, Houston refused to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy and resigned from the governorship, effectively ending his political career in Texas. This refusal to support secession and the Confederacy isolated him from many of his former political allies, friends, and colleagues in the state. His stance was seen as out of step with the majority of Texans who favored secession, and he was often criticized for his Unionist views. Indeed, his own son, Sam Houston Jr., enlisted in the Confederate Army and served with the rebels. Their relationship suffered greatly during this period, and unfortunately, Sam Houston died in 1863 before he could reconcile with his son. Despite his refusal to support secession, Houston did not actively work against the Confederacy. Instead, he urged Texans to avoid violence and sought reconciliation between the North and South. He hoped for a peaceful resolution to the conflict and the preservation of the Union. He did not live to see that vision become a reality. Stonewall Jackson, a Confederate military genius, found himself at odds with his sister, Laura Jackson Arnold, in the lead up to the war. When he left to fight for the Confederacy, they stopped speaking. While Stonewall Jackson was a Confederate general committed to the Southern cause, Laura Jackson Arnold and her husband, Jonathan Arnold, remained loyal to the Union. Jonathan Arnold was a federal government employee, and the family lived in the Unionist region of Western Virginia, which eventually became the state of West Virginia. Jackson was mortally wounded in May 1863 at the Battle of Chancellorsville and died from his wounds. Any chance of healing or reconciliation with his sister died with him there. They say you can't go home again. Abraham Lincoln's wife, First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, came from a Southern family, and this pedigree created great tensions between her and her kin due to her unqualified support for her husband, Abraham Lincoln. The conflict ultimately separated her forever from the Kentucky world she grew up in. Her family was on the opposite side for the most part. In fact, Mary Todd Lincoln had half-brothers who served in the Confederate Army, openly in rebellion against her husband and the Union government. Mary's half-brother, Samuel Brown Todd, joined the Confederate Army shortly after the commencement of the Civil War. Samuel served in the Crescent Regiment, 24th Louisiana Infantry, and tragically lost his life in combat during the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. He was the first of Mary's Confederate relatives to make the ultimate sacrifice in the war. Alexander Humphreys Todd was the youngest among Mary Todd's half-brothers and held a special place in the family's affections. He enlisted in the spring of 1861 and served as an aide-de-camp to Brigadier General Benjamin Hardin Helm, the husband of his sister Emily. Alex also saw action at the Battle of Shiloh. Tragically, he lost his life in a friendly fire incident in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1862. Regarded as the unconventional member of the Todd family, David Humphreys Todd left home at the young age of 14 and went on to participate in the Mexican-American War. When the Civil War broke out, he enlisted with the 21st Louisiana and took part in the Battle of Shiloh. During his service with the artillery at Vicksburg, he sustained severe wounds. He briefly held the position of commandant at Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia, but his extreme cruelty towards Union prisoners led to his removal by Jefferson Davis. So it's clear that Mary Todd Lincoln's Southern family was estranged from this sensitive woman. And yet, ironically, due to that same Southern origin, First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln faced criticism and ridicule from fellow Unionists who were political opponents of her husband, Abraham Lincoln. Her loyalty and actions were often questioned or doubted, and she became a target of public criticism. After the death of her son and later her beloved husband, she spiraled downward with mental health issues and financial challenges in her later years. The Civil War took its toll on Mary Todd Lincoln. Andrew Johnson, who would later become the 17th President of the United States, hailed from Tennessee, another state that seceded from the Union. Despite this wave, Johnson remained loyal to the Union, while many of his relatives fought for the Confederacy. Some of Johnson's family members, including his wife, Eliza McCardle Johnson, and two of his sons, remained supportive of the Union, sharing his views. However, his brothers and several other relatives were Confederate supporters. The most notable family feud involved his younger brother, William Johnson, who was a Confederate soldier and served in the Confederate Army. The two brothers did not fully reconcile during Andrew Johnson's presidency or in the years that followed. Their political and personal differences remained a source of tension throughout their lives. These personal tensions may have impacted on Johnson's relative leniency towards the Southern states after becoming president in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination. Johnson was greatly criticized as too soft and forgiving of the rebellious states and its leaders, and his policy of Reconstruction was seen as insufficient on many levels by Republican politicians and thinkers. These criticisms ultimately led to Johnson being impeached in 1868, though he was not removed from office. Confederate General Robert E. Lee also had been subject to tension with people prior to the outbreak of war regarding where his loyalties lay. Lee's American pedigree was without repute. His wife, Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee, was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. Mary's family, the Custises, maintained deep connections to the Washingtons, and they were firmly rooted in the Virginia aristocracy, where the father of the country hailed from. Lee's father, Light Horse Harry Lee, was a hero of the American Revolution himself. Robert E. Lee had a distinguished military career in the U.S. Army before the Civil War. He was a graduate of West Point, second in his class of 1829. He later credited his success as a general in large part to the education he received there. He served in the Mexican-American War between 1846 to 1848. In that conflict, Lee met another young soldier he would later face, Ulysses S. Grant. While it was not direct family members who tore the Lee family apart, the internal conflict for the general was great. Robert E. Lee's allegiance to the Union and the American Republic he had served conflicted with his loyalty to his home state of Virginia. Many Confederates considered statehood to be akin to nationhood, with the implicit right of secession if citizens of the state so decided. Unionists declared this idea to be sedition and illegal. Lee struggled with this decision and ultimately chose to side with the Confederacy and leading the Southern forces in the Civil War to great results for the South. His military brilliance prolonged the war for many battles before his finally succumbing to the greater power of Grant's Union Army. The two generals were cordial when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. They reminisced about their shared time in the Mexican-American War. It was probably an easier topic of conversation than the destruction they'd just finished. The American Civil War, with its complex web of familial divisions, will forever remain a poignant chapter in the nation's story. It tore people apart for myriad reasons, and many never were able to communicate with loved ones again. Civil wars are in some ways the most gut-wrenching as they cut through the heart of a nation and pull loved ones apart. Thanks for watching. History never ends.